Thank you.
So first and foremost, we should be clear that the full title of the movie is The Meyerowitz Stories, New and Selected. Very important to have the...
Yes. Good luck with that.
but it is crucial because it points to, the stories element is that this is an ensemble piece. And even though there isn't sort of narrative through line, you're seeing the lives of many different New Yorkers kind of united by their family bonds. You're exploring it through different perspectives, and the kind of chapter titles in the film kind of clue you into it. So just let's start with that. How did the stories concept first come to you?
Yeah, well, that was in the early stages when I was writing, kind of trying to write it, writing around it, writing different scenes, and just finding my way into the movie. I think a kind of, and this happens sometimes where the structure in a way informs the story, the character. It can go the other way too, where the character informs the structure and the story. But and I had some idea of that it was like an anthologized collection of short stories by an author. There was an Updike collection that I had read. It was about this family, the Maples, and I'd actually read it a bunch of years ago, but I was sort of thinking about it, and I was thinking there was sort of something moving about this idea of these collected stories that followed this family, and they followed the family, sort of the couple meeting, growing, getting married, having kids, and it's different than a novel because these were all published at different points in different years, so he didn't necessarily know the ending, and they end up breaking up in the book, and it really moved me because I think in a way that feeling that it wasn't preordained like it was in a novel, that when he wrote those early stories that had all the hope that you would have in real life in a funny way. So I kind of had that in my head that that's what it was. It didn't, and I kept the concept in the title. In a way, you don't need to know that to see, to watch the movie, or you don't necessarily get that from the movie, but it was something that cracked it for me, and that also informed, I think, also this family. And it's a family. It's a father played by Dustin Hoffman who has two sets of kids from two different marriages, and they're grown up, and that kind of compartmentalization of family, how family sometimes, siblings can be kind of kept apart by, have different relationships, and there's some crossover, but there's also some very different things. And so by thinking of it that way, and by placing one brother in one story and another brother in the other story, and keeping them apart till the third story, that gave me a lot. And I think after that made all the writing easier.
And of course, what comes out of this is the chemistry between these people is so essential. So when did you start to kind of visualize who these people would be? Because when I look at it, just on paper, Dustin Hoffman is the father of Adam Sandler and Ben Stiller. All of those people carry, I don't want to say baggage, but connotations. So, how did that sort of come together for you?
Well, I'd written it with Ben and Adam in mind. It actually, two things sort of, which is often the case too. People say, ask if you could talk about the screenwriting process, and often it's like a location or something seemingly minor, but that you're just wedging into, you're just trying to find a reason for it, or try to find a way to, because that's what's cinematic, that's what you want to tell. And one thing that I wanted to do in this movie was write about a hospital, what I felt it's like to be in a hospital, that I hadn't seen quite in movies before, and this personal coming up against the institutional, which we deal with all the time in our lives. But when you're in a hospital, you're so afraid, you're so vulnerable, you so want to believe that these people will take care of you, and that's not dissimilar to how kids feel about their parents, and that need to feel taken care of, and that they have your best interest in mind. And so that then crossed with talking to Ben Stiller, who I'd worked with before, and Adam Sandler had reached out to me years earlier and asked just sort of like he'd said, like, if you have something, I'd love to do something with you, which actors do periodically, and often then you approach them a few years later to say, hey, I finally got the thing, and then they'll say, it's a pass. I'm sorry, I just didn't respond to the material. And thanks for.
What a tease.
Yeah, well, yeah. I always think Hollywood is a place where they make you want something you didn't previously want, and then tell you can't have it. But Adam accepted right away, so it was a great version of that. But I had lunch with the two of them before I'd written the script, and we kind of talked about maybe they could play brothers. That might be interesting, and also we kind of came away from it thinking, well, there should be a physical fight between them, and so that's all I had. There was a physical fight between Adam Sandler and Ben Stiller. I've got to reverse engineer an entire movie from that. And then also, I knew I wanted to kind of fit I had no idea where the hospital would play into it. And again, the short story aspect of it kind of helped me design it.
Well, and with somebody like Ben, there's a certain kind of bubbling, neurotic character that he's played in different ways over the years. With Adam Sandler, it's interesting because people assume he's sort of the slapstick comedian, and that is not the character he plays in this movie. So what was it about the sort of what you've seen him do in the past that inspired you to give him this kind of character?
Well, it's interesting. When I first wrote the script and showed it to people, I wrote it very specifically. The Danny character was Adam and the Matthew character was Ben. But as soon as I showed it to some people, consistently people thought the reverse was the case. If I didn't tell them in advance, they just assumed that Ben was Danny and Adam was Matthew, and I'd never thought of it the other way. I don't feel much. For me, I just wanted to work with Adam, and I thought he could be great at this. Wasn't thinking about other people's sort of concepts of him or what they expect, or I just thought he, certainly things I've seen him do, but I thought he'd be very touching as this guy, and for Ben it was an opportunity, having done 2 movies together already. I felt where we could do something different too, where that Ben, in a sense, could play something closer to who he really is. I mean, he plays a successful guy in this movie. I mean, at least outwardly successful person in terms of what culture would consider successful, and
as opposed to the failure in Greenberg or something sort of.
Well, I think Greenberg in a way was a character very unlike Ben. That Ben found his own kind of personal way in, but he really transformed for that guy. And then While We're Young, for me, was in a way to use Ben. I thought sort of my version of maybe the Ben Stiller iconography of the sort of, as you were referring to, the sort of, how you describe it, but that sort of comic character, I wanted to sort of be able to work that way with him. And this one I thought was a way to kind of strip it all away and have him do something that felt like now the person I know quite well and who's become a friend. So in a way I was writing it more for him as the guy I know.
And then you have Dustin Hoffman, who really has entered cinematic consciousness over the decades. It's somebody who just tremendous amount of tradition there that you have to deal with. So in some ways, great fit to be a patriarch for all these different people. In other ways, as soon as he's on screen, you're thinking, oh, it's Dustin Hoffman. So. Well,
some movies, and some of my movies, I've had this feeling, but I think some movies benefit from movie stars, from people bringing their own associations with these people into the movie, and others don't. I mean, I've made movies, Frances Ha or Mistress America, where having Candice Bergen come in for a scene or Adam Driver pop up for one moment or something wouldn't feel right for those movies. With the part of what those movies, I think the spirit of those movies is discovery too, and you're seeing people you haven't seen before and how wonderful they are, and and this movie, I felt could carry the kind of weight of what you're talking about. So it wasn't, it's Dustin Hoffman, and it's also Emma Thompson, and it's Judd Hirsch and Candice Bergen and Adam Driver and even Rebecca Miller. People who I think bring something with them into the movie, and I felt like that's what this movie wanted in that way. I mean, Dustin Hoffman, I got to work with Dustin Hoffman and Randy Newman on this movie, and it's like, that's enough.
You're done.
Yeah. I mean, you could split them into like fourths and spread them out through my entire career, and that would be amazing. But to have them both fully on one movie, it was. I mean, they're both people I loved before I knew them, and so then I with Dustin, we had to find our way of working together, and and I'm also carrying, as everyone is carrying, this history into the relationship, which I'm both aware of and putting, in some ways, I guess, bringing into the movie, and then also I'm ignoring it on another level because I'm he and I are creating this guy for this movie only.
Well, and so something that comes out of this is, you have a body of work too, and expectations that come out of that. I think of, the New York milieu and the specific kinds of conundrums that people find themselves in. There are ways in which this represents, I think, a different sort of context for you in terms of the number of stories that we're processing and so forth. But in other ways, it feels very consistent with a lot of the films that you've been making over the years. And I wonder, how much that plays into how you think as a storyteller. Is this going to be seen as an extension of what I've done before?
Not really. I think I'm drawn to, each movie to me is a new experience. I'm drawn to whatever it is about this story or these people that I'm compelled to tell, and and I'm, what I feel is cinematic, and what I'm consciously pushing or trying things all the time, and trying to do things that scare me, and and not, because that's what's fun about it too. But I'm not thinking about really what I've done before. It's more something, we can talk about it. I can try and assess it, and people can tell me, oh, I saw this and this and this and this. But often I'm not really aware of it.
So let's talk about it, because I think the New York element is so essential to this movie. And it's not just New York, it's a certain echelon of society that has been scrutinized over the centuries, really. And sort of curious about what is your way into that world? I mean, whether it's Squid and the Whale, or it's Margot, or Frances Ha, it seems like you're sort of dissecting different kind of angles of a certain New York ecosystem. And obviously, you live here, so I'm assuming that's one starting point. But what else about that setting have you found so appealing as a storyteller?
Well, the city is. I grew up in Brooklyn. I live in Manhattan now. I have a personal relationship with it. Not for everything, but for some of these stories, I like. It's meaningful for me to shoot on a street that I walked on, as a child. If I go back to Brooklyn and I shoot on Montgomery Place, where I grew up in Park Slope, it's emotional for me. And sometimes Squid and the Whale, obviously, there were biographical elements, so shooting in that area had real meaning, and also very, very specific to the the sort of anthropology of that story. but even for the Mistress America, we shot on my old street and didn't have anything to do with it. Brooke was tutoring a girl on the street, and I just wanted to go back there, it brings something. It brings out something in me that I find meaningful. The same way it can be to use actors I've worked with before, or use friends of mine from childhood, to put my doorman in a scene. I mean, it's like I recognize it, and I think in some ways recognizing it helps me then also invent and fictionalize so I find the more I do this, I've kind of become more conscious of the sort of, I think this is probably true for a lot of artists in all ways, but it's like a conversation I'm having with myself as a child who wanted to make movies, who loved movies, and so I'm, but in some ways, in terms of the stories I'm telling, or in terms of the psychology of the characters and things I'm doing, there's more like, that's one way to do it, but in other ways are, even just for me, they have to be right for the movie, but it's things that that just put me in a kind of inventive space, I guess is a way to say it,
What sort of movies did you see that made you want to be a filmmaker?
In some ways, I think I just watched movies from such a young age on that by the time I wanted to be a filmmaker, I was already just immersed in movies. So, and it was an interesting, when I think about it now, I was, we lived in Brooklyn at a different time when, Manhattan seemed like a long way away, you could see it. But I talked to people, friends of mine, Greta grew up in Sacramento, or Wes Anderson grew up in Houston, and I actually relate to their concepts of New York, even though I was, much closer, and it was actually in New York, but I felt very far away from that place, and I think, it also had to do with probably how my parents felt and but there was that, I would go there, we'd have friends in the city, but it seemed like a long way away. It's sort of like what Saturday Night Fever is about. I didn't dance.
So the cinephilia element kind of came late for you?
No, it was there. I'm just sort of, I guess, it was a roundabout way of answering your question, I guess, of saying I felt both, and I'm sort of equating Manhattan with movies in a way, even though there doesn't have to be that way. But I think what I felt so far away from a world where movies were made. So even when I wanted to make movies as a kid, I both felt driven to do it. I felt like I thought in terms of movies all the time, but I also felt like that's not something anybody I know does, and I don't even know how you begin to do it. So it both felt absolutely possible and absolutely impossible.
But were there specific films for you that were sort of seminal in that regard?
Well, I was, it's like when I was a kid, to see an R-rated movie was such a amazing thing. When I saw The Jerk, I was, somebody was asking me this the other day, and I was thinking, I am as informed by the movies, it was like things that were forbidden were R-rated movies, and also I wasn't allowed to stay up late enough for Saturday Night Live. So when Saturday Night Live people were in R-rated movies and I could start going, that was like I was admitted into a thing. So I loved, anything with Bill Murray or Steve Martin or Chevy Chase, or and because I had cinephile parents, I would kind of try to turn this into a kind of auteur thing. So I would pick up on Ivan Reitman and Harold Ramis and John Landis and try to make some kind of argument with my parents about, which people now do seriously, I guess. But those movies informed, The Road Warrior was huge for me. 48 Hours, I couldn't believe how exciting that movie was when I first saw it. And, E.T. was my favorite movie, and, and like everybody, I'm the age of Star Wars, and everybody is, but I was actually, 7 when it came out, the first one, and grew up with it. And
But presumably you weren't somebody who said that's the kind of film I want to make, or at least I wouldn't.
At that age, I wanted to make all kinds of movies. You could have said, I wanted to be Steven Spielberg in some way, but I also, when I started to see Woody Allen movies, I related to that. And then when I got into college and saw Jules and Jim for the first time, I thought, like, holy crap, like this is, I saw Jules and Jim the same year that Goodfellas came out, and I remember it like blowing my mind, seeing that there were connections in the filmmaking, and when I saw After Hours for the first time, like everybody, you're seeing like just the luck of the draw. Like, it's like, who's your James Bond? It's like, what was your first Scorsese? I saw, King of Comedy, and then After Hours, and The Color of Money. Like, those were my Scorsese's, and then I, of course, went back and saw the others. But, I'm also seeing, like, Broadway Danny Rose and Zelig, because I just had missed the others. And so those become the ones that you're really, connected to. And that's why Spielberg was so big for my generation, particularly because you could see all those movies. Not Jaws, I couldn't see that, but I, all the others I could see, and they were so meaningful to me.
But of that movie brat generation, you're more of a De Palma guy, right?
Well, I'm good friends with Brian, but those are movies I could not see at that age. I could not go to Dress to Kill or Blowout, those I caught later. I think the first Brian movie I saw was maybe Wise Guys, actually, which is a strange one. It's a comedy, but then The Untouchables. But I was lucky; he made The Untouchables like right when I could see The Untouchables, and even though my parents would tell me like it's lesser Brian, I was like, not in my mind. It was great. And I think for me, all those movies inform what I do. I know, people, I'm not an obvious genre filmmaker, but they're all in there. I see not necessarily shot for shot, but they're like all of that influence. I actually, a sad anecdote given what I just heard a little bit ago, but I mean, I remember an interview with Tom Petty where he said they asked him what he was influenced by, and he said the radio, and that's how I feel. I was influenced by movies.
And the through line with a lot of what you were citing there, at least to some degree, is comedy. And the films you have not made a humorless film, unless I'm missing something here, and one of them is funny by accident. But I think they're all supposed to have humor in them. And I'm sort of curious about that because, a movie like this will be released on Netflix. Maybe it'll be categorized as a comedy, but I don't... Yeah, so tell us a little bit about that aspect of it. That people have these cleanly defined categories of, this is a comedy, this is a drama, and so forth. You sort of trouble that barrier to some degree.
Yeah. I think, and maybe this goes to, how I, sort of relates to what the previous question in terms of movies of my childhood. But I do. Some part of me thinks every time I'm making a comedy, and I don't know. Maybe I just have to. It's just some inner working or some inner workings that I can't shake, or I'm too scared to tell myself I'm going to do something serious and meaningful. I think I don't know. But I always think I'm making a comedy.
But it's interesting because the underlying premises for all of your movies don't necessarily register as comedies. They could go the other way in somebody else's hands.
Sure. But they also could be comedies. I get asked a lot, like, do you think about the balance between your movies have this sort of, this comedy and drama living side by side kind of thing, and do I think about that consciously? And I don't really. I mean, it's not that I'm not aware of it, or certain scenes in a movie seem more serious to me than others. I mean, that's true, but I don't. in terms of how I approach dialogue or the way we shoot it, I'm not, one thing for Meyerowitz, I was looking at a lot of Max Ophuls movies, and people know Max Ophuls, who's a German filmmaker. He just amazing, and visually amazing too. And you watch these shots, you don't know how he did it, and but I was looking at movies like The Earrings of Madame De, or Letter from an Unknown Woman, which are not comedies, they're serious movies, but in a way, a lot of the way he approaches it almost feels like they're shot like comedies. They're not that different from how a Lubitsch might shoot something. Like there's a sequence in Madame De where they're at the opera and she's missing her earring, and they go in and out of the opera, and there's two guys sitting outside the door, and they have to keep getting up to open the door, and it's a way, it's that thing that, when it's done well is so brilliant, where it's you're getting it all from these incidental characters because of them getting up and then getting food, and they think he's coming back in, and they sit down, and it's funny, but it's a very tense, serious moment in the movie, in this marriage, and I was thinking about that, and I thought, in a way, seeing it in somebody else, I could kind of identify it, which was, that he's kind of, consciously or not, it feels to me almost like it's shot like a comedy, and also there's something about his camera work that's so buoyant that it kind of lifts up what could be very, kind of serious stuff, and so I thought that was interesting, and I was interested in pushing some of the visual stuff in Meyerowitz and the camera work, and so I was both looking at him for that, but also I kind of happened on that observation anyway.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that, because the visual language of comedy doesn't get talked about that much, and maybe you have some ideas about why that is, but I'm also just sort of wondering, how do you map out a movie that, to a large degree we need a lot of dialogue and so forth in order to sort of orient us. So how do you go about mapping out the way you want a film like this to look, the way it's supposed to move, when so much of it is a dialogue-driven experience?
Well, it's different for every movie. I think I like shots that go on. I like scenes when they can to play in real time, and for people to, that for cuts to matter, and so I guess I don't think about it so much in terms of visual comedy, but which sort of contradicts what I was saying about the Max Ophuls, but but not to worry about that so much. I think there can be, a kind of visual dialogue that might seem counter to what's happening. I think of a lot of my dialogue as almost sort of ambient. If you look at the scripts, are much longer than the movies. Like the script for Meyerowitz was 170 something pages, and it's an hour and 50 minutes, which for me is long. It was hard for me to get a movie over 90 minutes until this, but all the scripts, Francis, While We're Young, Mistress, were all 130 or something, and then there often would come a time when I was editing them where I get to the hour mark and feel I hope we have enough material to get to, full length, because people speak over each other, things are thrown away. I write it all, but it's all kind of meant to be musical in a way, and the visual is a kind of way to either counteract that or to accompany it or to support it in some way. And so it's, depends on the scene or what we're doing, but that, I like dialogue that's off camera. I like not seeing the person talking. So all of that stuff, sometimes it's instinctual, sometimes it's very deliberate, but it's why I do a lot of takes also, which people talked about, but actors like to jokingly complain about. But because there's so much choreography involved, and there's so many, often I'm covering a lot of ground in one shot. So there's something that happens often in my movies, though, where it integrates in such a way that it doesn't necessarily read that way. I think people sometimes are surprised to hear that I do have shots that go on a long time, because I think, like you're saying, the sort of dialogue-heavy nature of them is such that people sort of remember that and maybe aren't, experiencing it the same way, which is fine too. I mean, in some ways, it's designed for that.
And I want to give people a chance to ask questions as well, but before we do that, I think it is notable, without digging into it too much, that this movie is being released by Netflix, because part of the sort of larger narrative of your career, it seems, is that you tend to work outside of tradition. You're not making big studio movies. And I remember seeing your name pop up in the credits for Madagascar 3 and thinking, oh, it would be really interesting to think about, what would more of your films being made in this context look like? But at the same time, it seems like maybe there is something about the stories you're telling that don't work in that world, that you have to kind of work on your own terms outside of that. What are your thoughts about kind of the limitations of the studio system?
Well, to be clear too, this movie was made independently and designed to be shown on the big screen, as all my movies have been. I mean, we shot it in Super 16, and Netflix bought it in post, and they've been incredibly supportive. But it's the movie was made the way all my movies have been made. It's not. There's nothing different there. I've worked. I mean, it's a bigger conversation, I guess, to talk about like what's happened to the studios and what another time, and I think there would be more support in the studio system for what I do. I came of age in this time, and but I made Greenberg with Focus when they were part of Universal, or still are, but as part of Universal, and I made Margot with Paramount Vantage, which was their art house at the time, and so I have done things also sort of that originated and stayed within a studio system, but I've been lucky that I've controlled all my movies and been able to do what I want to do with wherever the financing has come from. Up until this point, I haven't, I've certainly made movies for less money than I would have liked to have made them, because Squid and the Whale, I couldn't get near the budget, what it was budgeted for, and at one point I just said, well, I gotta just do this, so just whatever you can get, let's just make it for that. So that was the budget, was whatever we could get, and and sometimes with something like that, necessity becomes the mother of invention. You create a style in a way that works both for the movie and also works for you practically. But I haven't needed a ton of money to do what I want to do, and I've been lucky enough mostly to get enough money, to do what I want. But I've also done sort of things like Francis, where the whole concept of it was like, what if you and I were just shooting a movie right now? What if we just had a camera? What if this was the movie? In a way, that was the idea. And thinking, well, with technology now, I really could do that. And well, I didn't need to do it that way. I felt like maybe it would open up something and, provide a kind of freedom beyond money or finances even, just a kind of some different way of thinking about how to make a movie. And in some ways, it was like a first movie I never made. And it did. It really cracked something. And I think that movie, there's almost a magic in that movie that's beyond me, that came from, came from a lot of places, the alchemy of the whole thing, and Greta, but it also came from that concept of like, let's just not tell anyone we're doing this, and there's going to be about 7 of us, and we're going to do this in black and white, and we're going to shoot it on a Canon 5D, but it's going to be a real movie, and it's going to be as good as anything I would have made any other way. I'm not going to do this to do some B-side. This is going to be the A-side. And that was incredibly liberating, and I think informed the movies I made after it that were made, back in more sort of traditional ways.
You might want to try it again sometime, right?
I'm sure I will, yeah.
Could be doing it right now and we wouldn't even know because you do it secretly.
No idea. No idea.
So let's take some questions from the audience. Yes, sir, in the glasses. Just wait for the microphone because they're recording it, please. We need waiting music or something.
Thank you. I saw the film yesterday, and I thought it was really terrific.
Thanks.
There were a lot of New York institutions in the film, like MoMA and Lenox Hill Hospital. I was just wondering if you had difficulty getting permission to film in these locations?
Well, that's an example of something we could not have done on Francis. And again, that movie was right for the way we made it, but yeah, you can't, shoot in MoMA for 2 consecutive nights without people knowing about it. It wasn't, I mean, I'm trying to think in terms of the difficulty. I mean, the challenges were to do things on with the money we had to we had to work it out. But they were great. All these places. I mean, MoMA particularly really came through for us, and I really appreciated it because it was written as MoMA and it had to be MoMA. And really, there was no other way to. The iconography of MoMA was so important for that sequence. A retrospective at MoMA is different than some gallery opening downtown, and sometimes like Squid and the Whale was this way too, where you write something in, and that one we had no money, and I wrote in the Museum of Natural History, which I was told, you'll never get it. And if I didn't get that, I didn't even have a title for the movie, or let alone. And I, you find ways, and people come through for you, and it's always, I'm always really grateful for that because it, particularly as you're sort of going back to how you started. When it's a movie about the city, and these places aren't arbitrarily chosen, and it's great when the city comes through for you and you don't feel frustrated. Sometimes you're making your you think of making your ode to the city you love, and you find yourself in traffic, or just having a hard time shooting something on the street because everybody's, the city's not cooperating, and you're like, this would be so much easier indoors on a set somewhere, and but then there are other times when it comes through and you feel like, only in New York, kind of commercial.
It's not a bad commercial if you're gonna have one. This gentleman here had his hand up before.
All right. Recently, I watched a very fascinating documentary on Dustin Hoffman that I actually recorded on VHS many years before and never got to watch. But it was showing his whole career, and as you would know, one of the things he's been very known for is to want to do things his way and to butt heads with the director, and it showed tons of examples. Of course, some of the best stuff he ever did was improvised. Probably the best thing was Kramer versus Kramer, arguing with Meryl Streep's character and slams his glass one. Yeah, that was 100% improvised, and that's why the fear of Meryl is real. But I'm wondering how much, and he's much older now than a lot of the stuff he showed 45 years ago. What did you have that experience, and what are your thoughts about the actors injecting or having more rope, so to speak, than others?
Well, I'm always mildly insulted when people ask me if my movies are improvised, because sometimes I'm told to take it as a compliment, but I think I worked hard on this. I was writing this thing, and, you know, and then you just think all the actors made it up, and that's, you know. Dustin's actually very articulate about this, and if he were here, I would turn it over to him. So I'm going to be paraphrasing Dustin Hoffman talking about me, which is a terrible position to find yourself in. But he was very connected to what sort of a discovery he made, which, in a way, he helped me understand my material better that way too. Is that he was saying how stylized the dialogue is, and that it helped him understand it and understand how to play it, and also I think even helped with the memorization of it, because he saw it as musical, and it's true, because I think there's a kind of version of my movies, or at least a kind of feeling of my movies, sometimes it seems to be, I think, that feels sort of, there's a kind of reality to them, or something that feels closer. It certainly feels like more closer to human experience or everyday experience maybe than some movies are. But the truth is they're totally artificially constructed. I mean, the dialogue is all written. The actors, you know, I want the actors to do it exactly. You know, it doesn't mean I have, you know, they interpret it. I mean, it's their, you know, they're giving it life, but it's not improvised at all, and it's also very choreographed. So going back to what we were talking about earlier, so I was clear with Dustin, to get to your question. I was clear with Dustin early when we met, you know, that this is how I like to work. You know, Adam Sandler would say to me while we were shooting sometimes, we would be middle of the night on the street, you know, outside Museum of Modern Art, and freezing, and Dustin would have these like long rambling monologues that were, most of what he's saying is apropos of nothing except of whatever's going on in his head. And you know, Adam would say, like, can you imagine anybody else of his generation, you know, first of all, being able to do this and do it so incredibly, but also honestly give a shit to do it. I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, it's a lot of work, and it's hard, you know, it'd be hard for anybody. And he gave me everything, and he just, I think his understanding was that it was the best way to do it and to play the part was to give over to it. And that's what this movie needed, as opposed to, you know, maybe another, you know, experience he might have had on another movie where he felt on some intuitive level that the conflict, the you know, to improvise, to change, to push back was what that movie needed. But you know, but at the same time, he asks so many questions. He would always push me on the script and say, like, are you sure this is clear? I mean, he's a great storyteller beyond being the actor he is. I mean, we were having like dinner about 3/4 of the way through the shoot, and we had yet to shoot any of the hospital stuff, and he said, do you think maybe we need another reference to the Whitney? There's a plot line with the Whitney also, and people haven't seen this movie, it's just like a bunch of museums in New York. But
not the Guggenheim.
No Guggenheim, no Met Brewer. You know, because it comes back at the end, and he's like, do you think, and this is a scene he's not even in, well, he's in it, but it's not his character. And he was right, and I wrote it in and added it before we shot those things. But he's always seeing the whole movie, and it's, you know, a thing he discovered about this character. Well, we discovered it together when we were rehearsing, but he was telling me the story of how he sort of figured out Rain Man, of sort of what, in some ways, what the story was, because he developed that, you know, that movie. And he said for him it was realizing it was like Midnight Cowboy, because in both movies it's the other character's journey. His character's a constant. And that was, interestingly, I discovered as he told me that story, which I was just interested in hearing just because it's great to hear Dustin Hoffman talk about his movies. But I realized that was the story I was telling too, is that his character doesn't change. It's everybody revolving around him, and it's their journey. And I was also thinking, though, again, the sort of guts to do that, when he, so many actors want to have the redemption, and I had so much trouble casting Squid and the Whale because anyone who wanted to even entertain the dad wanted some redemption, and Jeff Daniels was sort of like, didn't care, and that's partly what made him so great in it. But Dustin is the same way, is that he is fine if it's a character he feels he can play. He wants to serve the movie, and not some sort of ego trip for him as an actor.
Let's do one more all the way over here, just not to ignore this side of the room. Sorry. Yeah, on Niall.
Hi. I was wondering if any of your characters are ever based off of people that you know or your acquaintances, and they recognize themselves as these characters. Do they ever get angry, or what are their reactions, and how do you deal with that?
We're going to end with that one.
It's a juicy one.
Yeah. We should sidebar. What's interesting is it's often the people who get angry are the people I didn't think I was doing anything. They're like, I can't believe, that. Yes is the answer. But, I think certainly my close friends at this point, I had a friend coming last night to the movie, and Greta reminded me right before the movie that I had actually taken a couple things from there, things that were true that they had done or something. And so I called him right before the movie. I was like, I just remembered. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about this earlier. And he said, he's like, at this point, he's like, I expect 3 or 4 things of mine to turn up in each of your movies. So I'm not surprised, and thanks for the heads up, but that's fine.
Who was it?
We'll sidebar on that. But so my friends, I guess, in some ways expect it. But I mean, I would never take anything. I don't. That would be private. That was told to me in confidence. But I think the thing that Mike Nichols told me, I met him after I had made Squid and the Whale, and he, and Mike said, like, a great thing about every subject on earth. So there's like, you could quote Mike Nichols about everything and find the perfect thing to say. He was just so smart that way, and he said that seeing the movie reminded him of why he got into movies in the first place, which was revenge. And I know what he means, and it doesn't mean you're getting someone specific back. It can be revenge on an experience you've had in your life, or it's like, but there is something that empowers you, to want to tell these things, this way, and use this thing and make sense of it. And often the things that are really specifically from people have nothing to do with that person. They're just a way to use something that feels real to me, that helps me create somebody else. It's like I was talking about, shooting on Montgomery Place in that same way. But yeah, people have been furious at me.
Well, now everyone has to go see the movie to figure out who you're talking about here. Let the guessing begin. But the film opens in late October, just a couple of weeks from now, in 2 weeks. So hopefully most of you will get a chance to go see it in the theaters. It looks really great on the big screen. So thanks for sticking around.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.